Hi, welcome back. Week 8 in Mark's Headroom. Gonna make myself real uncomfortable here. I'm not prepared. Well, I am prepared, but if you've been watching the last few hours that I've been presenting on the 5th day of my fast, um, you get the gist of where I'm coming from. Trying to lay it out here and kind of find what happens. Make this an experimental space where it's not preformed to meet some deliverable or entertainment or education, but just sharing and trying to connect authentically with others who are of like-minded thinking. So I did make a list this week of things that I thought were observations that just kind of popped into my head, and I kept a running list of those. So let me go through that list to start off with here. And then I'll show some conclusions that as I submitted that list to some AI to try to get to bounce them off of a obviously a mechanical perspective of what's going on with Mark and maybe relative to what's happening in the world. I'll share some of that feedback with you toward the end. But some interesting notes that I came up with here this week. And by the way, I've started recently to publish on Kindle or Amazon Direct. Um, I've got about 20 books that I've written, and I'm beginning to publish those and release those for the public. I may actually hand a few to people that are around me, and they're available in ebook and in paperback form. They're, I think, maybe $5 or $6 for the ebook and 12 for the paperback. And I think about 7 of them are available right now. My initial intention was to put about 5 out and let those kind of soak in the collective consciousness, so to speak, and just see if anybody was reading and what kind of audience and feedback I got from those, and then release another 5. But as I've until I get all 20 produced, I think they'll all be available out there on KDP for purchase. And I'm giving away quite a few. I'm learning about marketing, and since I'm not driven to make money, although I'd love to find some support for this channel and for other of the endeavors that I pursue. That's an opportunity to give back if you feel so inclined and you're able. But I'm more inclined to try to find ways to give them away to the right people if I can find the right people around me, and or have some people, reach out on through this medium and and find ways to basically to get the information out there through these books, which it sounds like I don't characterize my own my own work very very well, but it looks like the feedback is that it's kind of an exploration of consciousness, and through that consciousness, it gives you perspective on your individual um, role, and maybe as you develop your own understanding of your individual self, you kind of see some purpose and meaning in your life, but that is an iterative process with your environment and what's going on in the world, your community, the larger, perspective of your community to the maybe state or country, and then, some kind of global trend. But that's kind of the perspective of the entire 20 book um, process is the totalitarian perspective, but it starts small and with an individual awakening. And the series is called the Awakening Chronicles. And so I've got the first 7 books out there, And I'll probably, by next week, I might have all 20 out there. It's a little bit of a mechanical process of getting them prepped and loaded up into KDP and through their process. It's pretty simple, pretty easy, but that might be an interesting, and you might actually enjoy some of the stories that I have woven into or from much of the spiritual and the development work that I've been doing on myself over my lifetime. So one of the first notes I had here is about identity through affiliation. If any of you have ever been part of an organization and maybe a profession and been part of a big company, there's a perception that you have in the community and with everyone around you that kind of bleeds into an identity. And it may be an identity that you just kind of hop on, and because you're a member of X organization, you kind of enjoy some of the benefits of that. And that gets blurred into a sense of safety and security and being known throughout your community or your lifestyle, however, you're recognized. Like I know some people at the gym that used to work for IBM, and that does kind of characterize their social group and their kind of their function in as being, semi-smart, people that were involved with a large company that, for the most part, was on the kind of the cutting edge back in its day of delivering technological solutions to businesses, and they have a certain culture around them, and um, they continue to operate that way. And I think some of these people may be retired and enjoying the lifestyle here in Austin. And but that identity is carried, with them even as they retired. Now, if you happen to leave an organization prematurely and you didn't go through that cradle to grave process, excuse the term grave, but the uh, the identity shift that you encounter when you lose your job or you've been fired maybe, or if you've elected to do something more aligned with who you may feel like you really are, when you step away from that big company and that identity and that daily ritual or role that you've been um, living, it's a shock. And if you look closely, at what's happening in your system is that your identity has shifted, and that's what gets really scary about change. Is often your self-perception as well as this collective experience, or this experience between you and the collective or the community and environment around you, which gives you a sense of purpose, belonging, and safety. So I noticed that, that identity by affiliation, that can be a blessing and it can also be a curse, because of course it depends on what you're identifying with as to and how it fits with your values and your, the ultimate meaning that you're going to possibly derive from your life. So it's not I don't have one answer for everyone, but it's just something that I try to make note of in in the process of meeting and understanding people and seeing where they're at. And if they ask for, some feedback or assistance or whatever, that affiliation is something that's very observable in a lot of people. It can give you a lot of insight as to how to reach others. And, the dangerous thing is when there's a super false identity operating rather than who they really are. You can kind of see the writing on the wall that there's at some point in time in their life, they may encounter kind of a crash, a realization that they've been living or kind of riding a wave that could could collapse, and they might have to face who they really are. There's a man that he approached me, I bet it was 8 or 9 years ago at the gym, and he was quite a bit older than me. I'd say probably 20 years older, and he admitted he was having a lot of trouble. This just happened at the gym between weights, and we kind of struck up an interesting conversation. He was a former FBI agent who had worked and kind of was in leadership position in San Francisco, and he had retired, but he'd been undercover. He'd worked on investigating and uncovering a lot of white collar crime. So he was part actor, part businessman, and ultimately part of the system, which was an interesting person for me to run into. And so I had a lot to learn from him and to examine in myself as we interacted with each other. As you may know, from just to give you a quick thumbnail, I'm an ex-athlete. I also do film acting and have used acting and psychology for personal development for a long time. And my father was in law enforcement, and I was exposed to many of the things that this guy, spoke about. And he'd also done a lot of international work. And since I've been an oil man and run workshops and had some oil interest all over the world, it's kind of given me an interesting perspective to share with someone like this. But the interesting thing that pulled and weighted the conversation down, and ultimately I think compromised our continuing to have a relationship, was that in one meeting at a coffee shop, we got to the bottom line that he was suffering from a large identity crisis. He was so wound up into who he had been in work and business, and he felt like whenever he stepped away from that identity, that suddenly he was in this void or in the abyss, and he couldn't connect to his wife or his children. And he was lost, and he was feeling things that were really suffering, or that he was really suffering with, and he didn't have the tools psychologically or emotionally or environmentally around him to allow him the sensitivity to deal with that vulnerability that he felt coming over him. So, and I was, 8 or 9 years ago, I was a little bit more. I was still putting all these pieces together. Today, I'd love to go back and touch base with him to see how that process has continued. But I just bring that up because a lot of people, as they're facing some of the changes that have occurred in our lifestyles, as lifespans have increased quite a bit over the past 20 to 30 years, as the transparency has become more of an operative factor in our daily lives, and the fact that a lot of people no longer have pre-planned retirements and benefits the way that they once did, when organizations were kind of built and maintained to provide a sense of full life support from cradle to grave. And so that's an adaptation that we're seeing across society. It's a place that we can reach out to people that, from a standpoint of really understanding from a consciousness standpoint about where people's needs really are, and to comfort them without forcing them back into some kind of, rigorous dogma that basically just takes the problem up from over here and puts a Band-Aid on it and lets them continue to operate until they die. I mean, who am I? That may be part of the bigger plan that needs to occur, because I don't have the outcome for every person or situation or group, but I tend to try to share a level of understanding that can facilitate outcomes that are really aligned with people's deeper meanings, if that's what they're here for. So I found that to be, um, I wrote this statement here. Let me read it. It says, being a member of the group, assuming a false identity that's not yours, but making it your own, to find your place in the collective and live a pain-free and comfortable life. Maybe that's so until, as I've seen and heard, at the end, a lot of times everything does become clear. And that's the point that you realize whether you were living authentically or whether you were living a lie. And I think some of the pain of that, at least my fear, is that you're people that live an ultra comfortable life and don't face the discomfort of being human in their own life are basically setting the stage for future generations to need to deal with that. At some point, every habit, every addiction, every ritual, every dogma creates an escape from dealing with the real issues. And I just have this sense that maybe that's why I'm here, is to try to help us hold steady and understand that we do have the willpower. Like, I'm fasting on the 5th day right now, and I've done this for 4 years, to sustain some of the things that the collective says would be unhealthy or uncomfortable or impossible or crazy. Well, you be the judge if you like. So every community, every bubble operates with the sounds or with stereotypes. So this is part of one of the themes that's in some of the books that I've written, is that the environment has has its own existence. It's kind of like organic matter that we all comprise over the face of the earth. Well, the organic matter in a certain region kind of comes together collectively and energetically with a certain vibration and a certain tendency to like, if I walk into a certain place in Austin, it's a completely different experience than walking into Paris or London or New York. And, I was shocked last time I was in New York. I was at an airport and I looked and I mean, I'm 6'4", I'm taller than most, but I looked and there was a massive amount of people around me and they were all shorter and much darker. And I really stood out as an albatross of being one of the few white men there. And I felt like everyone was looking at me as if I shouldn't be there or as if I was different. And I was different. And I could look around and I could see, of course, this is the way that I operate. I looked around and I saw a lot of people with a lot of differences beyond the stereotype that I just described. And, that was an experience that I've had over and over and over again that has kind of perplexed me until recently. And I realized that, just a fact. Every community does have its own certain set of biases and preferences and way of living. And that's true for what I have characterized as bubbles, that have like a commercial viability kind of baked into the way that they operate. And you have to adhere to those roles or rules to operate in that bubble. And there is some or some survival kind of baked into that allows people to survive in that bubble. And the operants are not necessarily fundamentally sound. They may be temporary, and they may have enough money or resources available in the community to sustain that bubble or whatever potential falsehoods or truths that are supporting that operation for, who knows how long. And, who am I to say? I think all these bubbles, whether it's Enron or, some religious dogma that ends up playing out into an outcome that reveals, or that maybe the Catholic Church, not being critical of the church, but just the faith that a lot of people had in those priests that at one period of time were systematically getting away with a lot of child abuse and rape and sexually molesting people. And, that cover up that lasted for years did a lot of damage. So there was a bubble there that was protected, and some of the technology that's emerged with the transparency in the last few years, movies, stories, people feeling comfortable enough to come out and make statements that in the face of the institutions that were making everyone feel a false sense of safety and keeping secrets, um, were divulged. So I think I'm here not just to help divulge those things, but to actually create a platform for us to have comfort and safety in emerging from those truths into a future that we build that's more fundamentally sound. And that's coming out in some of the books that I'm releasing, is that although it's a set of fictional books, they do create a narrative that could be used to kind of walk into a safer way of operating into the future. So, and I've gone out through my method acting time and, dyed my hair, assumed, a limp and, some of the classic actor techniques, and put those on in public, and even memorize lines, to say into the phone or to approach and kind of try out, just like Daniel Day-Lewis might in exploring one of his characters, um, to see how that feels. And it's amazing how, when you dye your hair or you put on a hat or you wear a different color of clothes, the shift if you're really watching and feeling and perceptive, you can tell that you're being treated differently. And even if you go outside as a woman, it can be a shocking experience versus being a man. And I'm not going to go a lot deeper into that right now because that's really not my point about the difference between sexuality in this um, bubble here in Austin versus other places. But there's a lot to explore there about um, the prejudices and biases and what people encounter and just a regular everyday setting at the grocery store, for example. The difference between being who I present myself as I do, today, versus if I dressed up as a lady, put on a wig and a dress, and walked in. Some people are just looking at everything on the surface, and they might take me as a female, and other people might see me as a man dressed up as a woman, and that could be an entirely different experience. Um, Another note here is art is now filled with more cleverness than humanity, and we have this intellectual mode that's often taken for brilliance or genius, or kind of like divinity. Like, there's this, if a celebrity um, does something, it seems like there's a following that quickly assembles around whatever they're doing. And I'm noticing that a lot of the celebrity is around how clever or how smart or intellectual. they are, which kind of goes along with a general theme in society of things getting more automated and patterned, and kind of almost like, you have celebrities being stereotyped and cast into a certain um, dogmatic role that they embody in the kind of global consciousness. And it's funny, as an artist myself, or as someone that's an experimenter in consciousness and in life, um, acting at one point seemed like would be a great place to land because you could do these different roles. But what I see is most of the people that are quote unquote successful at that get typecast and locked into a particular role. And I know several people, who are actors that do that professionally, that either accept, or sometimes it creates um, a lot of pain for them because they really were looking for freedom, and they find that confining to have all their roles look exactly the same, even though they may move from one genre to the next, or working with one director or one group, to another. They're kind of doing the same old thing over and over again. So I'm glad I'm not part of that. Don't tell my agent that, but um, I don't say no, but I do find that when I've done, if I've auditioned for something a few months ago, and then they come back and they want me to read again for the part, and there's often all these delays in producing commercials and films and TV series. So when they come back, um, I'm kind of like, wonder, am I going to be the same person I was, 6 months ago when I did that audition, and am I really excited about doing that character or that role now? Because a lot of times I think some things happen for a purpose, and I've never really found that role that I wanted to do over and over and over again, and that's why we're here at Mark's Headroom, because obviously organically this is something that I'm comfortable with. And that's also why I do future wise energy and transcend it. I find something in my soul that gets expressed, and between the writing and the filming and the production of it and distribution, it helps me a lot. So this is a very intimate process for me artistically, and I'm trying to find ways to bring what's in my soul forward and share it with others with dignity, and let it be available. So that's something that I find. I actually, there's a memory that I have about an artist doing work that might be pushed under the bed and not even used in their lifetime, and they may die and it gets discovered, and wow, it's beautiful and it has an impact on others, and it's not for their sustenance during their lifetime, but rather for the impact that ultimately had on others. And who am I to say? I mean, I'm not here to die and leave something behind, or to live and enjoy, the benefits of distribution of what I'm putting out there in the day. That's a bigger, it seems like a bigger choice, or a bigger operating factor than mine, um, than I can handle alone. And predetermining or making that an objective, a commercial objective, is not necessarily something that I do very well. And I've always been open to working with other people who might come in and help manage some of the delivery of some of the products that I create, and continue to be open to that. Interesting note here on my fifth day of this fast. When I lived in Kingwood, Texas, I used to do this fasting from time to time over there, and I would also play with different characters that I was creating. And I found that one of the things was that most characters, well, a key component for me is the physical. So what you eat is an influence on how the character behaves and everything. So when I was running companies in Houston, I used to challenge myself. I'd leave the house in Kingwood, and there was a donut shop in the middle of town, and I'd stop there and I'd buy 2 or 3 dozen donut holes, and I would challenge myself to eat them all by the time I got to the edge of Kingwood. So in a matter of maybe probably 10 minutes, I'd try to down all those. And I don't know why I made up that little game for myself, but I guess I was pretty bored. Um, oh, this is interesting. I've noticed since I put some of my future wise energy, my oil man pinings on video on LinkedIn, that I'll get kind of an anonymous kind of a headhunter approach me on LinkedIn, and they'll say, "Would you be interested in working with?" There's a wealthy family business that has a business interest that needs exactly the kind of advice that you offer. And would you be interested in working with them? And I'll say yes. And so they'll send me usually and this has happened at least 4 times. And there may be another 4 times that I've really been particular in noticing and documenting in the last maybe 6, 8 weeks. It may have happened several times before that kind of went beyond my that I didn't notice as clearly. But what happens is that they don't want to email their clients' information to me, and they don't want to present the business plan to me up front, but they'll want me to have kind of a sideline conversation with the founder. And the founder will want to work through Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp and kind of have a conversation first before they introduce themselves. And they usually do present themselves as an attractive female. And what happens is that it's almost like someone's given me my own business plan or my own consciousness whatever I'm expressing, kind of fed that into an AI system and is serving it right back to me and asking me if I want to be part of this. And if one of them said they'd fly me to LA, or the other one wanted me to come to New York or Dallas to meet them and discuss, and even offered to pay for all this. And what I've really found is, yeah, it may be kind of flattering that someone would go to all that work, but it's kind of a grift, and it's really kind of creepy. And but nonetheless, I'm just throwing that out there to kind of warn others. And I don't know who to contact at LinkedIn. I'm not necessarily all that concerned about this, but I can't be the only one that this is happening to. Um, I continue to examine how my work is received or rejected or ignored, or looked over by the collective. The algorithms don't necessarily, have um, a big predefined financial, commercially viable role for my content. And, I really kind of love that in a way, because by definition, a new platform, a new frontier, a new way of working should never have something that really feels comfy and has a lot of people jumping on board from the beginning. And I keep finding myself coming back to one of the neuroscience discoveries that really supports something I want to hear, I guess, is that we only notice about 5% of what's happening. And I'm just seeing this over and over again. And that's not a, and I'm learning to live with it and not be as shocked by it or discouraged by it, because there are a few people that do express themselves and come along and maybe you just give me enough encouragement that I need for the way that I operate to keep going. And so something that I've also taken some comfort in is seeing that how much of an alien or an outsider I am to most communities, even though I identify and I have this empathy and I guess love for my fellow man, or maybe it's the purpose that I'm here for, to connect with people in spite of all the operants that are around us in our environment. And so that's given me some self-knowledge, and it's a view that I've learned to, just since I started doing Mark's Headroom, to accept and understand, and I hesitate to say love about myself, but maybe that's where this is heading, is that, the disconnect does give me a perspective that, if used properly, can bridge that dissonance between the experience that people have had that are operating within their own family system, their own business system, their own community, whatever bubble they're in, and connecting to their humanity is not the disconnect that I feel. It's that, the connection is human. The disconnect is with maybe many of the views that they have of how things work. But anyway, it's given me a lot of more comfort than I used to operate with in placing and feeling less chaotic inside about entering into new bubbles, communities, without um, closing myself off to the people and their humanity within them. So I think it's given me a better capacity to be empathetic and learn and love and operate within what once was a deterrent, because I think when you work through trauma and you you understand the dangers that your body was being programmed or conditioned to fear and push away, and how injustice and suffering and all those components that follow the trauma experience, how they can be, you can get stuck in those, and those can define who you are, rather than once you learn to accept those and understand those, then the growth can really occur, and you can evolve into someone that is not stuck in those old traumas, but rather the window that the trauma opened for you can be used to transform yourself beyond just another member of the community. And I say just another member, and I catch myself when I say that, because when I find myself using the word just, it's kind of putting that down, and I'm trying not to put that down. But in my own operation, I feel like I've not found my tribe. I haven't found my community, although I operate within one, but I operate with some dissonance and disconnect. But I connect at the human level. And I think there are people that I know are operating at that level within the communities and the bubbles that are not in my tribe, my real tribe. The few of you that are listening, at this point in this um, version of Mark's Headroom, are probably closer to that tribe. And by definition, our connection may be deeper and stronger, but not meant, at least at this point in the evolution of mankind, to be a community or to be a bubble. Those opportunities and circumstances and collective platforms may not exist for another it could be 5 minutes, it could be 5 generations, it could be 5 million years. I don't know. Uh, I find it interesting to come across people that feel like they're great communicators, especially if they're writers, because it really astonishes me how much we miss whenever we try to put everything into words. I used to love poetry. I still love it. I just have a different view of it because I think the interesting thing is that it has a mystery kind of baked into it, just like lyrics from music. Um, I love it, and I think it's really cool because sometimes they can say things and maybe even get away with things that, if explained or presented in a real factual or logical bullet pointed way, might be offensive. Sometimes the poetry, the things that are kind of said artistically, or at least in old forms of of art. I'm not talking about clever intelligence. I'm talking about maybe some seeds that were in some old lyrics that years later, whenever you're repeating the lyrics, you kind of wake up and you realize something. I kind of like that, and I think communicators that have an objective of, okay, I'll say this, this, and then people will do this, or everyone will see the world like I do. I find that to be a rather shallow, bandwidth of that view. It has troubled me in the past, and I've tried to let that go because in my own communication, I often, will begin to speak, and I realize, and other people even come back to me and have recognized this for me and given me that feedback, that it seems like I don't have a deeper or a purpose. Well, often the purpose um, that they're not seeing in what I'm doing is exactly the purpose in my delivery. It's not trying to be a commercial delivery. It's not trying to tell people what to do. It's not trying to work from an objective that I am aware of before I begin speaking. And that's kind of counter to American business and most of the things that operate from education these days is all everything is from an intent and some kind of pious knowing about what you're going to do next. And that's not my way of operating. An interesting thing happened this last week. I was in Clarksville, which is a neighborhood near downtown and near the ACL, the concert that just wrapped up its second weekend here in Austin. And see, this is October 17th. So last weekend on the 10th, I was I went for a walk outside in Clarksville at precisely like 4:30, and I noticed this band. I could hear the sound, and on the hillside in one part of Clarksville, you could hear the sound from the ACL Music Festival. And I heard this band. And I thought, I know that sound. Well, I'd been following this group, and it's funny. I kind of stumbled upon them. Someone was watching a show and on TV, a series, and there was a band that played some music in that series, and I used Spotify to identify that band, and it was some kind of female band. And so I kind of listened to that song offline, and my music app, probably Apple Music, picked another similar band that had a song that I even liked better, and it was Wet Leg, which turns out to be this British indie rock band that's won some Grammy Awards recently. And so I went back and was studying them this last, couple of weeks. And they had a song that was, I think it's about this Chase Lounge. And it starts off, I went to college and I got the big D, the diploma. And then suddenly it just moves into, do you like your muffin buttered? And that was such an interesting contrast of but what it was, I think the point was that they'd done all this intensious prep or the intentional preparation and trying to go along with what society, said you need to do to get along and survive in the world today. And they found themselves working as a waitress in a serving muffins. So I thought that was hilarious. But the really interesting thing was that I'd never even looked at the lineup for ACL. It's been 5 or 6 years since I went to a concert there. I think the last one was Willie Nelson's last um, final appearance at ACL, which was fascinating. But anyway, I went and was fascinated with the experience there. I love the Foo Fighters. That was my first ACL that I remember. This opening with the Foo Fighters. But back to what happened this last weekend. I walk outside. They're playing the exact song that I'd been kind of dissecting and doing a deep dive on understanding what made this band work and interesting to me. And of course, the lead singers, obviously, if you look up Wet Leg, you'll see she was a very attractive female. And she really, at least in her early work, was just doing very little. And now that she's become more of a performer, and I think they're about 3 to 4 years into their celebrity, and it's really kind of transformed their presentation, so to speak. And it's funny, in some interviews I listened to her, she talks about what the challenge is to live up to the expectations people have of artists and of musicians. So that's another. Um, oh, this is really one of my final comments here to myself was I had this memory of this acting coach that I had in Houston who had been really, had been very successful, beautiful lady. Um, who'd worked in LA as a model and actress and was part of the Screen Actors Guild. And she really took me under her wing. She kind of coached me and led me into exploring what it would be like to be Ted Danson. And being Ted's also 6'4", and we have some similar physical appearances, although I think Ted's maybe 20 years older than I am. She was very wise, very smart, very insightful, and very helpful for me. But one of the things, and I won't mention her name here because of what I'm going to share, is that how awful people can be to each other. Because I know several other people in my world today that I'm fairly close to that have had some really vicious stories that they've shared from their upbringing. And she told me once she could really relate to some of the pain that I was dealing with as I was learning to express myself. She was force-fed as a kid. And there was this view in her home that there was not enough. And the father was feeling, like the world was pressing down upon him and everyone was at odds with him and it was making her sick. And so but he was forcing her to eat and eventually she would throw up. And the father in his fury would force her to eat that vomit. And then when she didn't cooperate with that, brought religion and morality into it to guilt and shame her, essentially for being alive and trying to survive. And that left an imprint on her from her early childhood into adulthood that I believe she was haunted by. And she may be another one of those people I need to reconnect with. Like another friend of mine here in Austin, who's I think maybe 15 to 20 years older than I am, that was beaten by his father as a young boy. And he told me once that that his father would beat him until he cried, and then he would tell him he was going to beat him until he stopped crying. That hurts. Well, that's the human experience. So I had somebody right before I went on camera last week, it sent me a note maybe a few hours before I went on camera. It looks like it was a day before I made my, week 7 video. And he wrote a rather lengthy comment here that I mentioned. So I'm amazed whenever people, will write a long personal, email, of course, or a message on YouTube. Of course, these do, appear with some safety and some built-in anonymity to the medium. And so anyway, I just wanted to make a comment there that those notes really do mean a lot to me, and I do look and I try to respond, and I am open to, direct messaging and email connections and even a video call if that works for some people. Some of the feedback that I got earlier that I mentioned at the beginning of this was that I have a unique perspective. Well, obviously beyond just fasting for 5 days and eating 2 days a week for whatever 4 or 5 years now. I'm an authentic outsider. My journey from the Ozarks through petroleum engineering, multiple life traumas, and spiritual awakening gives me credibility across vastly different worlds. And I speak from lived experience, not theory. Well, that's what the AI is seeing. Pattern recognition as a spiritual gift. I do tend to see connections that a lot of people miss. And I'd like to find ways to use that more and more in my life. And so I'm looking for those. Transparency is a healing force. My belief that exposure of hidden truths seems like collective healing, does align perfectly with these global trends that are going on around us now. We're seeing unprecedented revelations across institutions, and I do tend to see them and have some comfort with them, and I think I am here to help other people, realize that injustice is kind of a natural, it's kind of like the grieving process, noticing that there's injustice and then trying to find a platform to improvise and build for the future is so imperative, rather than just stopping at the protest or stopping at the recognition of some crime or injustice or the people that are being left behind or overlooked. That's just one part of it. It's not about that. It's about really finding a solution for the platform and the way to live ahead so that is not as apt to occur. And I think a lot of that has to do with accepting ourselves and our shadows and owning who we really are as humanity and getting away from some of the biases and prejudices and morality around things that suppressed our humanity, and creating all these laws and rules and rituals that really disconnect us from the real deeper sense of who we are as human beings that you can trust, that are fundamentally necessary for our best operate, our whatever best is. Okay, this is interesting. It says 54% of people experiencing spiritual awakening weren't previously spiritual. So over half of people that are experiencing an awakening spiritually, coming into touch with things, weren't spiritual before that, today. And 70% are awakening largely alone, creating a hunger for authentic community. So there is a lot of people that find this happening. 70% of those that are awakening are alone. They don't have support. So if you're listening, maybe I'm part of that support system, and maybe, um, we could broaden that. I'm ready to play my role. AI and technological advancement are forcing questions about consciousness. And this is something I presented to a friend of mine that's in the AI business here in Austin. He's a younger guy, very well equipped with a lot of knowledge on like the Bible and things like that, and has some family values that I identify with. And I proposed to him that one of the beautiful things about AI is that we can offload all of these rituals, all these patterns from our lifestyles, and let AI operate from those rather than being identified with them as who we are. Have the freedom to let the machines do the rituals and the patterns and the things that are necessary to sustain our survival. And that gives us some distance from some old identities that we used to see as ourselves, our professions perhaps. And that's life shattering. And it's not easy to accept what that's going to actually feel like over time. But we're going to have a chance to see that probably in the next 5 years. Global transparency movements are exposing long hidden truths across all sectors. So this space between worlds speaks directly to people feeling displaced by rapid change. And in a sense that something bigger is happening or emerging, which I believe is happening. So those the books that I'm putting out there about the Awakening Chronicles, um, I'm hopeful that that is going to give perspective to some deeper truths and fundamentals that could be referenced and explored and understood better than any past generation in mankind. That's a kind of a bold goal that just kind of slipped out of Mark's mouth here and at the end of this session of Mark's Headroom. My perspective embodies what the AI calls evolutionary authenticity, understanding that one, individual authenticity serves collective evolution. Two, crisis and trauma are consciousness catalysts, not mere suffering. Three, transparency and truth-telling heal divisions at both personal and societal levels. Four, the failures and outsider experiences position me as a guide for others navigating similar territories. Well, that resonates with me. It's interesting to see. This is my resonance and my style, or I'm not preaching from a pedestal, and I'm taking more of a reporting stance. And I think that may be kind of why, from the trenches, the algorithm is probably having trouble, placing me, as is, not just the algorithm, but I think the audience is I'm hoping to find, that has a similar sense of hope and dignity. And so I will continue to put it out here, and I hope you all have a great week. I'll see you again next week.